One of the claims that Mormonism makes is that they possess the priesthood, and they're the only ones who really possess the real priesthood. And yet the Bible talks about priesthood, and you see all of these other churches outside of Mormonism are doing things similar to what Mormons do. They're baptizing, they're have certain ordinances or teaching and all the rest. So we really want to sort out a little bit of the idea of priesthood, especially if you're coming out of Mormonism and you're used to living with the priesthood. Maybe you were a priesthood holder, and in your new church you're trying to figure out, well, where do I fit? Or maybe you liked being married to a priesthood holder, and now in your new church, how does that work? So we're going to talk a little bit about the priesthood and comparing the Mormon to the biblical ideas of priesthood, and particularly how that actually works out in practice. So let's just remind ourselves about the Mormon priesthood. How would you define that and describe its function?
Well, I think from my years in the LDS Church, I kind of thought of the priesthood as a very powerful entity, a very insightful, a lot of wisdom, and I also thought of it as having somewhat frightening, actually. As a young person, I thought it was kind of scary that these people had all this authority. And I also saw that everything had to be done by the priesthood. Nothing could be done in the church without that. And I guess another point that I recall is the heavy hierarchy. There seemed to be very important that the bishop and his counselors, then we have the elders quorum, and we have, as a youth, we have the teachers and priests quorum, and etc. And everything was very hierarchical and done maybe with kind of a military-like, perhaps, way of doing things.
Right,
very
chain of command.
Chain of
command
is a good word, yes. And they going into other ceremonies of Mormonism, it seemed in the temple, for example, that it was even more formal and special, and presented as very, very important that the priesthood authority was there.
Right. Now, by comparison, in churches today, the churches that follow the Bible alone, there are still leaders, right? There's still pastors and elders and so forth, some of the biblical leaders. How is that different from the priesthood hierarchy?
Well, I think the way I've learned it over these years is that, and I read the Bible, I don't see, first of all, a strict hierarchy. I see somewhat of a fluid situation. Maybe that's a pretty heavy word to use, but there's a little bit of fluidity to it.
I agree, yeah.
We have, the Apostle Paul going out and appointing elders, and we don't see that Peter is requiring Paul to come back to Jerusalem every year to make a report, or that he has issued commands for him. We even see Peter, who was certainly one of the heads of the early church. We even see Paul writing the New Testament and making some corrections to his behavior that were a little bit out of line. And I think that would be a contrast to, certainly my experience, I think everybody's in Mormonism. There really isn't a place to be doing those kinds of corrections of your superiors.
Great point.
And there's a real rigidity to the system.
Yeah. Exactly. You look at the New Testament and you see the apostles in Jerusalem, you see all these other churches throughout the Mediterranean world. They don't seem to have that same kind of top-down relationship. It's more of a collegial relationship even.
And the Bible even says that as Christians we should submit to one another.
Yeah.
And that it's a mutual, as you say, collegial sort of a relationship. When I was on my mission years ago as a young Mormon, I felt that I had to follow all the rules, and every place we had zone leaders, and we had very much that way. And yet, as I was reading the New Testament and the whole Bible actually in German and English, the thing that really hit me strongly was that while the church, the LDS Church, claimed to have the same organizational structure as the original church Jesus made in ancient days, I found that not to be true as I read the Bible. and having to read it in a foreign language and really stop and think what
Right.
those words meant really was a blessing to me, because it helped me see those differences. It was really one thing that the Lord really used to help
Yeah.
me come to Him and believe in Him for
Yeah.
salvation.
That's great. That's great. So what about authority then? If authority is not vested in this power, this priesthood kind of power, then how does authority work in the biblical church?
The way I would describe it is that the authority in the church today, in the church that Jesus established and that we have throughout the Christian world, is really rests in the authority of the Bible.
Okay.
And I sometimes use a little metaphor here to explain it, or an analogy of some sort, and I see it somewhat like a constitutional form of government, where you have a country that has a written law,
Right.
and leaders are elected and recognized by the people. And the people have every right to remove those leaders and talk to them and have a back and forth conversation. Right. And we let those leaders in a country like that have leadership, and they do a good job or they don't. And so we have this back and forth relationship. In the New Testament churches, we see the same thing. Mm-hmm. As long as those people, and throughout history I must add, when church leaders have followed the Bible, then that's a good thing, and the people hold them in check. And then we see another concept that's very important, that's quite different than what I saw as an LDS person, and that is that Jesus, when in Matthew, he was talking about leadership, and he said to his disciples, and he said that the church should never be one where the leaders are lording it over or are having dominion over the church, but the leader should be a servant.
Right.
And certainly there's all kinds of leaders in the church, but we do see that pattern. Jesus was a servant. He came to serve in salvation, and the church leaders are to follow that example and be servants. And then the counterbalance again is that the people of the church, they hold the leaders accountable. So it's a two-way street, much more fluid and back and forth, and quite different than what I've experienced as an LDS person.
Right. Especially since the ultimate authority is in Scripture, in the Bible.
Yes.
And so all of us then are accountable to that,
Yes.
in whatever our calling or position is. If we're a leader, if we're a leader at some other level, or just a follower, we're all accountable to the Bible.
Yes.
And that's, I think, probably the biggest difference
Yeah.
that I see. So I hope that helps you to understand as you begin to get acclimated into a new church home after having left Mormonism, then you can start to see how leadership works, how authority works. It's really not a function of priesthood. It's really a function of the Bible's authority, and hopefully that will help you to understand how things are working in your church. By the way, I just mentioned, if you have leaders, if you're in a church where the leaders are not accountable to the Bible, then that's probably not a healthy situation. You might want to keep looking before you settle in there. Hope that's a blessing to you, and keep watching as we continue to add videos that will help you in your transition from Mormonism into biblical Christian faith.